I've said many times that you cannot understand the Gospels unless you understand Phariseeism and what it is that Yeshua is challenging, what he is vehemently violating and holding the feet to the fire of the Pharisees in the first century. And we have back with us Nehemiah Gordon, who has contributed so much of his knowledge, and the reason why I could do the chronological Gospels and get so many of these points correctly is because this is the world that he grew up with, and we have seen this in fruition just this last, this inauguration that took place with the Torah police out in Washington, D.C. I asked Nehemiah Gordon to come back with us because we're going to get into the book of Galatians, some hot stuff. Nehemiah, great to have you back.
It's great to be, Michael, back. It's really great. You know, we were talking about Ivanka Trump and how she was condemned by the Torah police for riding in a limousine to the inauguration and the events surrounding that on Shabbat. And you know, to me, I heard about this and I saw this exploding all over on Facebook and on Twitter, and people were like really condemning her, and it made me think, as I said last week, about Colossians 2:16, let no man condemn you when it comes to these different matters, and one of them is Shabbat. And as we were discussing this, you brought up the issue of Galatians 2, so I'm going to let you run with that. That's and as we were reading it together, something popped off the page for me as I looked at the
really cool that's stuff. Right. Yeah, as soon as I got your message, this is immediately what came to mind in Galatians 2, chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. Paul, Shaul, is speaking of this incident in which he is at Antioch. Peter's there with them. They're eating, they're drinking. Everything is going great with the Gentiles. They're having just a great time. But then certain came from James. Now, we read about this in Acts 15, that there were Pharisees who become believers in Yeshua, but they're carrying all the baggage of their Phariseeism with them. And so now they show up in Antioch, and Peter now no longer is going to eat with the Gentiles. He was fine before the Torah police show up. Now these guys come in, and so I want you to take from there, because Nehemiah, we all know that you are an incredible Hebrew scholar, but you read the Greek fluently, and as far as understanding Shaul, Paul, as a Pharisee and where he's coming from, you understand him like very few people on the planet understand them. I see Paul tortured all the time, even in the Hebrew roots moment, because they don't know the Torah from where he's quoting. You know what the rules and regulations are. Take us into that incident in Galatians.
I mean, it's true. A lot of people I encountered in the Hebrew roots movement think Paul was the first Calvinist, and they try to force him into that mold.
Yeah.
And look, like me, Paul was raised as a Pharisee, and he even said after his conversion that he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. I'm not a Pharisee of the Pharisees. I'm a Karaite Jew now. But you know, so here's his verse, Galatians 2:12. It says, "For before certain men came from James, he, meaning Peter, would eat with the Gentiles. But when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played the hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy." Barnabas, who's even Jewish, is playing this game. So why is Paul condemning Peter for this? What's the hypocrisy, right? And I think most people read this and they say, oh, well, I mean, it's clear they were having ham, and he was eating ham until James's people showed up and he stopped eating the ham. Well, okay, does that make sense that Peter was eating ham? It's possible, but that's not the way I read it. I think it's more likely see here you have to understand the Pharisee context. So what is the most basic meaning of what it meant to be a Pharisee in the first century before the destruction of the temple? And the most basic concept was to separate yourself from uncleanness. This word prushi, Pharisee, comes from the word parash. Parash means to literally, the most common usage and the literal usage is you would have a lump of dough and they would pull off a piece of that dough and give it to the priest. And once that piece was removed, that piece of dough was holy, and that was to Pharisee the dough. And that's called lahafrish challah. Challah, which you have on Shabbat, literally in that context refers to the piece of dough, not the whole loaf, but actually the piece of dough taken off. So they're they're Phariseeing the challah. They're taking off the piece and giving it to the priest. And from then forth, you can't eat that little piece of dough. That is holy and belongs to the priests. So the Pharisees come along and they say, we're going to Pharisee ourselves, not the dough, ourselves to God by not eating meat unless we're in a state of ritual purity. Now, the Torah only requires us to be in a state of ritual purity to eat sacrificial meat. Deuteronomy 12 comes along and says, no, if you're eating non-sacrificial meat, the clean and the unclean may eat of it, like the deer and the gazelle. And why does it say deer and gazelle? Because deer and gazelle can't be brought as sacrifices. So always the clean and the unclean can eat the deer and the gazelle. And if you're eating a cow or a goat or a sheep, if it's a non-sacrifice, it doesn't matter whether you're clean or unclean, you may eat of it. The animal has to be clean, but you don't. The man doesn't have to be clean. The woman doesn't have to be clean. So the Pharisees come along and say, no, all of our meat will eat in a state of ritual purity, and we'll separate ourselves from the people, the masses, and the Gentiles who don't follow these rules. So there is Peter, and he's sitting with these Gentiles, and they're eating perfectly biblical, clean food, but the Gentiles touch the food, making it unclean, according to the Pharisee understanding. He has no problem with that until the Frum police show up and they shomer shame him like they did to poor Ivanka Trump. And they say, Peter, what are you doing? Our rabbis have taught that we're supposed to be holier, not just from the Gentiles and from the Jewish masses. We have to be Phariseed from the masses. And so then he gets embarrassed and say, well, what will the creatures say? Ma yomru habriot is the Jewish expression. What will the creatures say? And he says, okay, I can't do this. I'm going to have to pretend. I have to follow these Pharisee rules, even though I know they're not God's rules. And the really cool thing, as we were discussing this before, Michael, is I pulled up, I do what my friend Keith calls tap, tap. And I pull up on my computer program here and I say, well, it says in Galatians 2:12 that Peter withdrew and separated himself. I have a sneaking suspicion that word has something, that's an important word. And I look it up in Greek, and the word is aphorizo, or in this form of it, aphorizane. And that actually sounds like the word Pharisee. And this is something ancient translators often did. If there was several different ways to translate a word in the target language, they looked for a word that sounded like the original word. And it's very clear to me that the original word here is that he withdrew and he Phariseed himself. And so they translate it that way in Greek, aphorizo, he Phariseed himself. And then you have in the Aramaic and the Pshita, parash, the same exact word, he Phariseed himself. And then I did the next thing, I looked how is this word used throughout the New Testament in the Greek. And the really cool thing is it's used in this Jewish sense of to separate yourself for holiness. And which is fine when it's the proper way to do it. So Romans 1:1, for example, it talks about Paul, a bondservant. It says, called to be an apostle, Pharisee to the gospel of God. So he's separated to the gospel of God, aphorizo, same word in Greek, and probably the Hebrew background behind that is the same word. There's no negative connotation there, clearly, right? The negative connotation that Paul is talking about is in Galatians is because he's separating himself, he's Phariseeing himself people in a matter where there's no prohibition. God didn't command you not to eat food touched by. That was the whole dream that Peter had. Don't call those men unclean, which is what the Pharisees have done, and therefore don't eat meat that they've touched. That was his dream that he had. And that's fine in his house, but when people are looking, all of a sudden he separates himself. And one last thing, 2 Corinthians 6:17, Paul is speaking here. He says, come out from among them and be separated, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. If you look at the context there of what he means about unclean, he's talking about food sacrificed to idols. So food sacrificed to idols, that you shouldn't be eating, that you shouldn't be consuming. But food that was just touched by Gentiles, there's no prohibition. That's a man-made rule and regulation. That's something the Pharisees invented. And when you do that, when you Pharisee yourself according to man's rules and not God's rules, then you're a hypocrite. That's what Paul's teaching.
This is absolutely incredible. And of course, this all puts to light, taking us right back to Acts 15, that there were Pharisees who become followers of Yeshua, but they bring all of their baggage with them, all the rules and regulations with them, because, you could probably speak to this, since we've got like 30 seconds left, that when you're raised as a Pharisee, you don't know the difference between the written Torah and the oral Torah.
Oh, it's deeply ingrained. It's very difficult to it took me years to distinguish what does God say and what does the rabbi say he says. And it really takes years of deprogramming to get back, to peel away the layers and get back to the Word of God.
And that's why I say, Nehemiah, you've been such a resource for the chronological Gospels as far as helping me to understand that, because without your background, I was raised as a Baptist Jew. You know, this is not my world, but you being raised as a Pharisaic Jew, you know the difference. And it was your deprogramming and you being able to articulate these very things that Shaul is dealing with all through his letters and all through the book of Acts that has brought so many things to light. Nehemiah, thanks for being with us. Hey, next week, I'm sure we're going to have more updates. Trump is going wild with a pen. I really thought the man was going to get up there and be a politician and do absolutely nothing. That's what I expected, and my goodness, am I thrilled. I'm absolutely thrilled. And we're seeing the division of America just like Obama attempted to divide Israel. We're seeing the division of America come down. Next week, let's get back into it, okay?
Shalom.
Okay, shalom, brother. Bye now.